All right, last presentation as I mentioned earlier, or maybe I did mention earlier, is for the Government Accountability Office. I'm really pleased that Ming Chen is here from the GAO, came here for the presentation. The title of this is Strictly Business, an examination of China's natural resource problem and its engagement with Latin America. And Jane LaFamme will kick it off from her team.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for sticking around for the last presentation. We're so happy to be wrapping things up for the Public Policy Practicum project, as just pointed out. And along with Penny White, Rojab Shankar, and Juan Andres Camus, today we're going to be talking a little bit about China's resource acquisition strategy in Latin America, and specifically trying to explore the nature of China's economic engagement within this region. This is especially important given China's growing scope in the world market. And just to move forward, as Joe mentioned, this project is for the U.S. Government Accountability Office. We're incredibly thankful to them for involving us on their project, exploring what China's role is in emerging countries and developing countries. So just a little bit about our research motivation. We want to understand three things about this economic engagement. Number one, we want to understand China's commodity trade. So basically, we want to understand here how just tremendous economic growth and also a domestic resource constraint has compelled China to look outside of its borders in order to acquire natural resources. Second, we want to learn more about Latin America's importance to China. And here we want to learn about sort of, what are the fundamental interests that underlies economic engagement, and why is Latin America such an important piece of this puzzle for China moving forward in order to sustain its economic growth. And third, we just want to figure out China's strategy for natural resource acquisition. We want to figure out the types of strategies or financial instruments that China uses to engage Latin American countries. So what's important to understand about this story is just a little bit about the background, namely why China has grown so much over the past 30 years. In 1979, China opens its doors to economic engagement, reintroducing itself to the world. And we can see here that since 1979, China's GDP has grown 13% annually. So it's grown from around $247 billion in 1980 to a vast almost $12.5 trillion in 2012, and this is huge. During this time, China has become the world's second largest economy. It has also become the world's largest manufacturer and exporter of goods. While China's growth is largely industrial, we see that China has grown largely in the manufacturing sector, and this is very important. We also note that the exports of raw materials has decreased significantly for China. So what this means is that China's exports of raw materials and natural resources has decreased from around 49% of trade in 1985 to around 11% of trade in 2008. And you contrast this with the fact that China's exports of manufacturing goods has grown around 10% annually every year. So we just want to know sort of how this domestic resource constraint has motivated China's interest to look outside of its borders. And we note here that the Chinese government in 2001 promoted a strategy that it's called Zongchuku, and what this means is going global, and in this policy it has encouraged its state-owned enterprises to look outside of its borders to engage foreign countries in terms of acquiring natural resources for the future. And this is a big motivating interest, and we think this is very important. One of the places where China has looked in the future is Latin America, and you can see here that Latin America and Chinese trade has grown around 28% annually in the last 15 years. So from 1995, trade grew from $4 billion to around $253 billion. Again, we see here that the industrial growth is sustained by natural resources, which is abundant in Latin America, and this is a very important relationship moving forward, because we think that a large portion of this trade is going to be concentrated in natural resources for the future, and we want to know just a little bit more about what the impacts are. So just a little bit more about China's economic growth here. We know that China's economic growth is motivated by natural resource acquisition. It needs to acquire a ton of natural resources to sustain its industrial capacity. We can see here, for example, if we take the example of copper, copper is really important for China moving forward because it's used in a lot of infrastructure, for example, buildings, copper wiring, and also it's used in manufacturing products, so for example, batteries. You can see here how resource constrained China is. You can see that China has about 5.4% of the world's reserves. However, it consumes around 27% of the world's copper supply annually. This is just huge. You can see here that the numbers really just demonstrate the type of mismatch and why China needs to look abroad in terms of getting these natural resources and sustaining its economic growth for the future. I'm going to turn it over to Juan right now, who's going to talk a little bit more about the products that are important to Latin America and, you know, sort of where we go from there.
Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. So the first question here was how China has maintained the economic growth that Jane pointed out, considering the natural resources constraint that the country has. Any guesses? Well, the answer is pretty obvious, going to the market. And what we found is that there's mainly four commodities that has moved this development forward. The first one is oil. And China, up to 2011, was the second largest importer. Currently, is the largest importer in the world. And oil by itself composed about 71% of the whole mineral fuel that China imports in 2011. Secondly, iron. China again is the first world importer of the world, and iron by itself represents about 75% of the total mineral ores that China imports in 2011. Thirdly, copper. Again, China is the first largest importer in the world, and copper by itself represents about 10% of the total mineral ore that the country imports that year. And fourthly, soybean, again, is the largest importer of the world, and soybean by itself represents 92% of the total agricultural product that China imports in 2011. The way how China is approaching the market by itself is really important because they are applying what is very well known in finance. They call a diversification portfolio strategy. And we can see here in this graph how China has really much more on middle-sized producers in 2011 compared to 1995. In contrast, Japan, which is another export driver economy, is doing exactly the contrary. They are relying much more on a few large importers rather than in a large, broader spectrum of middle-sized importers. We see the same trend for copper. Again, China is diversifying its portfolio of import suppliers, and Japan is doing the contrary. And for iron, it's exactly the same story. So China is making a huge effort in order to diversify and ensure the long-term supply of these natural resources. What is the relationship between China and Latin America in this context? The answer is that we found that these four commodities represent 70% of the total export of Latin America to China in 2011, so it's very relevant. Furthermore, copper by itself, the copper exported by Latin America by itself represents 40% of the total copper imported by China in 2011. The total Latin American iron exported in 2011 represents 25% of the total iron imported by China that year. Regarding soybean, 60% of the soybean imported by China in 2011 came from Latin America, and 40% of oil. So Latin America is extremely relevant for the growth of China. What is interesting, though, is that these four commodities came mainly from 5 countries in Latin America: Chile, Peru, Venezuela, Brazil, and Argentina. And so this growing relationship between China and Latin America has not been distributed equally among the 23 countries of Latin America. Instead, there's 5 clear winners with this relationship, and these winners are these countries. Kenny is going to explain how China is approaching each of these countries and the strategy that the country is applying for engage with each of them.
Thank you. So we've gone over why China is interested in Latin America, and it's interested in natural resources. Now we want to understand how China goes about getting these natural resources. So we have actually identified 3 main instruments that China uses to go about this. The first are loans, the second are foreign direct investment, or FDI, and the third are free trade agreements, or FTAs. Now it's important to note that each of these instruments can be used in other ways and aren't necessarily restricted towards natural resource acquisition. However, we're interested in this context, we're interested in how these are used towards procuring these resources of iron, soy, copper, and oil. So the first instrument, loans, just to give you some context, these development loans given by China in 2010 were roughly $37 billion. In comparison, the World Bank, the largest multilateral lending institution in the world, only gave about $15 billion in the same time period. So China is a major player in these development loans. And the way these work are basically, the loans don't come from the Chinese government per se. They come from state-owned banks within China that then disperse the cash to an agent in Latin America, either a Latin American government or oftentimes a company operating in Latin America that's controlled by a Latin American government. Now, China makes 3 distinctions in the type of loans that it gives. There are grants, in other words, a lump sum transfer of funds, interest-free loans, that is an interest-free loan, or concessional loans, where loans are given out of a sub-market rate interest rate. Now we found in the context of natural resource acquisition, there are really only 2 distinctions that matter. The first are generic infrastructure loans, and the second are energy-backed loans. Now energy-backed loans are essentially a loan given by a Chinese bank to a Latin American, typically a Latin American energy company. And instead of those loans being serviced by cash payments, the debt is paid back instead by oil shipments. So what that does is that gives these Chinese banks a claim over future oil production going forward. And not only that, but these loans are typically used to expand oil production capacity, building more oil rigs or investing in more technology. The second type of loans, infrastructure loans, it's a little less clear how those directly improve natural resource extraction. However, one thing we found is that the infrastructure being built as a result of these loans is usually meant to facilitate natural resource extraction. Let me give you an example. A lot of times you'll notice that harbors near critical mines or near critical oil production or near critical farmland, a lot of times you find Chinese companies retrofitting these harbors and making them, improving their access. So the second instrument we looked at is investment. Now, it's difficult to come up with accurate numbers of Chinese direct investment in Latin America because the sums that China reports are vastly underestimated. So the estimates we've used have been gathered by independent studies looking at press releases and talking to government officials and trying to come up with some figures. What we found is that in 2010, China was estimated to have about $15 billion in foreign direct investment into Latin America, which was roughly 10% of the total that year. Another thing we found is that Chinese companies concentrate much more strongly in natural resource acquisition than their Western American and European counterparts. In total, about 20% of total investment in Latin America was towards natural resource extraction, whereas we found in China in 2010 85% was towards petroleum production alone. So China is much more concentrated in getting natural resources through investment than other countries. Now there's two main, in practice there are two ways that these firms go about doing this. First are mergers and acquisitions, and that's where a Chinese company, typically a state-owned company, purchases equity in another firm operating in Latin America. This can either be a domestic firm or a multinational firm with a base in that country. Essentially what that does is that vicariously gives the Chinese government legal claim over the equity of the company, or in other words, legal claim over future production of resources. The second way to do this in practice is through a joint venture. And usually these are employed when outright acquisition is not feasible for either regulatory reasons or otherwise. And what this turns out in practice is that the Chinese firm will put up the capital, put up the money to make the initial investment, and then the operations will then be run by the firm currently involved. Now the third main instruments are free trade agreements. Now free trade agreements are used in many ways, but in this context they're towards reducing tariffs and improving market access between China and the other country. And what we've found is that whereas countries like America, the EU, and Japan, when they sign free trade agreements with these Latin American countries, what they're after is economic harmonization. That is, setting the same regulatory standards across different countries, setting the same intellectual property rights across different countries, etc. Whereas China is really just concerned on reducing tariffs and reducing the regulations that it takes to export natural resources. So really China, first and foremost, or more than any other country we found, is after natural resource production. Now we've given like a brief overview of how each of these three instruments are used. My colleague Roshan will go about presenting a country-by-country basis to give you more concrete analysis of how all of these three instruments are combined into a very adaptive and coordinated strategy.
Thank you, Kenneth. So we've gone over the instruments that China uses in Latin America, but it's very important to note that each of these instruments are used in a very specific way based on the state of the economy of the country as well as the political state condition. To explore how these instruments are used, we're going to have 5 case studies, which are on the 5 countries that Juan mentioned, were the most important countries in this continent. We're going to start off by talking about Chile. Chile has an open economy, which means that it wants to engage with a lot more countries, get its exports out there. And the most important resource that China wants from Chile is copper. It's important to note that the copper market in Chile is mature, which means that there's a large player, Codelco, which is the national corporation in Chile for copper, and that Chinese companies cannot go directly in the country and start investing or purchasing companies, which means that China had to engage with them in a different way, which they did through a free trade agreement. China signed one of 3 free trade agreements that they have in Latin America over the last decade. It's also important to note that Latin America has become incredibly important over the last 10 years. All 3 of these free trade agreements were signed in the last decade. What they've done in these free trade agreements is, as Kenneth pointed out, is provide market access. They don't care about all the norms that the WTO or other North-South free trade agreements try to explore, which is to try and integrate economies. Their main aim was to provide market access. So for example, 92% of all Chilean exports were duty-free when going into China, which means that it was easier for Chilean exporters to get their goods into China, while only 50% of Chinese imports coming into China were duty-free. Sensitive product lines that the Chilean government wanted to avoid its producers to be excluded from were gotten in this free trade agreement, and they were not part of the duty-free. What this means is that China was giving concessions to Chile. And why is that? Because they secured a long-term copper purchase contract for 20 years at the market price that they set with these Chilean negotiators. Chile got a secure consumer of this natural resource, and China has hedged its bets and got a long-term copper purchase contract. That's why they gave the concession. Another example of copper is in Peru. Again, they're an open economy with exports booming. However, the important thing to note is that they have an underdeveloped mining sector. For this, China tweaked the way they use their instruments. Again, because they're an open economy, they have the free trade agreement with them, where again you see the same pattern, where there's an asymmetry in the tariff reductions that are there in the different countries. However, they also added that with investments through mining firms. So state companies and state banks in China invested through mining firms either directly or through multinational companies, as was pointed out earlier, and tried to develop the infrastructure around the mining companies. So while this free trade agreement didn't get them a long-term purchase contract like it did in Chile, they managed to work their way around the infrastructure and making the conditions feasible enough for them to be in a condition in the future to get that contract in the future. Next we come to Venezuela, where its most important export to China is oil. Other than the fact that Venezuela was, at least recently, a politically at-risk country and doesn't have access to global capital markets like these other players do, China has a very strategic relationship with them. The Chinese National Petroleum Company has a partnership with their national company where they have control over 5% of all Venezuelan production. The loans for oil that Kenneth talked about before, where instead of interest payments coming back to China, there was a possibility of oil shipments going back, was used by them. In total, between 2008 to 2010, $50 billion worth of loans for oil were used by China in Latin America. Of that, 38 billion went to Venezuela alone. This shows that they are willing to change the conditions at which they loan money depending on the country. Well, this was a great deal for both the countries because one, it mitigated the risk of default for the country itself. It ensures China either gets the payment back or ensures a reliable stream of oil imports. And third, for Venezuela also it's a great deal because there's the mitigation of risk on the borrower's side. It's also important to note here that all these numbers that we have have been very difficult to find because none of this is publicly available information. So anywhere where we've been mentioning numbers, it's either being cross-referenced through embassy releases in the host country or by trying to correlate world data with Chinese official government data and trying to see where these projects have been going. A lot of the data has not been transparent, which is why we're trying to extrapolate strategies rather than getting exact numbers. Our fourth case study is in Brazil, where you see that the world's largest producer of iron is present already. Again, China doesn't want to go there and try to boss itself around. So they have a partnership with Vale, where they get Vale to ship out iron to them, to these Chinese ports. For that, they have used loans, where they've been able to send loans to Vale to develop ships, which are shipping iron ore directly to China. In oil, as was spoken about before, China is investing in oil here, but possibly not as much as in Venezuela. But the main projects that they're engaging in, for example, like their investment through their national petroleum company, Sinopec, through Repsol Brazil, was their first endeavor in deep water oil rig oil production. So they're also gaining R&D advantages in Latin America. Finally, Argentina, where in the past they've had oil investment, but due to the nationalization of their oil industry, it is on a hiatus. But that's an important future commodity to look at. They've been involved in soybeans. As China's population, while not growing, is becoming richer, they've started to demand better and more food. And for that, they've pursued a strategy where world over, they're looking at trying to secure food crops. For example, the Betuhan Group has invested $1.5 billion in the last year in irrigation infrastructure development in the Rio Negro province in Argentina. And again, just like you saw in Chile, where they secured a long-term purchase contract of copper, they were able to secure a long-term soybeans contract. So through all these case studies, you see that China has used all these instruments in an intelligent way in each of these countries depending on their political and economic situation. However, based on these, where we're leading to is what our conclusion should be. It is very difficult to give policy recommendations like all our other practical presentations have done, because they have far-reaching implications on anything. So for example, if you said that the US should indulge in free trade agreements which give concessions to other countries, that would severely affect the trade balance between them, which is currently positive. So what we're going to do is try and find learnings from each of these instruments and how they've been used, and try to give that to the Government Accountability Office so that they can inform their policy decisions in the future. And for that, I turn over to Jane.
Thank you, Roshan. So what are the main lessons that we've learned from China's economic engagement in Latin America? Primarily, the first finding has to do with Chinese loans. We note that it's very difficult to quantify the loan amounts in a lot of cases just because the data isn't available, and China tends to understate the amount of loan it actually gives to the recipient countries. But overall, we note that first, Chinese banks tend to not impose any policy conditions on the borrower governments. Second, Chinese banks are open to loaning money to Argentina, Ecuador, and Venezuela, which are countries that aren't as able to borrow on the world market as other countries in Latin America. And third, they accept oil sale agreements in lieu of interest payments, which helps out countries like Venezuela in terms of borrowing money. And finally, China tends to employ generic infrastructure loans as development aid. And as Kenny pointed out, these loans tend to facilitate the building of harbors and just other transportation methods to help China acquire these natural resources. The second finding that we have is in regards to Chinese foreign direct investment. We note here that China uses FDI mainly to purchase operations in Latin America, and it uses these operations to gain technical acumen. Notably, China also uses the groundwork there, learning from the company and also taking in, just learning about the foreign customs in the country to sort of facilitate the acquisition of resources in the future. And of course, the FDI is backed by Chinese banks. And as I mentioned before, this is part of China's grand strategy to go abroad, in which the Chinese government encouraged state-owned enterprises to reach out to these countries and sort of use Chinese banks to help facilitate these relationships. And finally, the third instrument that we've explored is Chinese FTAs. We note here that China uses FTAs in small open economies with small industrial bases. These are countries like Chile and Peru. However, China does not use FTAs with large economies with a large manufacturing base like Brazil and Argentina. And we feel here that the manufacturing base poses an issue in which China has to compete with these countries, so FTAs aren't really possible at this time. Also, we note for FTAs that China is willing to give several concessions on imports and exports in order to secure its natural resource supply for the future. So overall, what does this mean? It means that primarily China is using its growth strategy to acquire natural resources in Latin America. China is definitely resource constrained, and given its need to sustain its economic growth in the future, it needs to look outwards. And Latin America has the resources that China needs in order to sustain this growth. In order to acquire these natural resources, of which there are oil, copper, iron, and soybeans, China uses a combination of loans, investments, and FTAs as three strategies to engage these countries. We note that China uses a highly adaptive strategy that's dependent on these countries and commodities, taking into account sort of the political landscape of the country, whether the country is big, small, whether it has access to global markets. And we note here, this is very important, that China is engaging these countries and using this adaptive strategy for the long term. This isn't just a one-shot game for China. It's definitely looking forward in order to sustain its growth for the future. And we think that this adaptive strategy is a huge cornerstone of that. Looking forward. So in this case study, we've explored sort of China's economic ties with Latin America. However, we want to know if any of these economic ties have translated into the political arena. For example, this is an important issue with regards to Taiwan. So we know that China has pretty contentious relationships with Taiwan. And in a lot of cases, it's encouraging countries to sort of de-recognize Taiwan. Notably, 12 of the 23 countries that still recognize Taiwan are in Latin America, and we expect to see some sort of political action there moving forward. A lot of these countries tend to be small, so it's likely that we'll see China using sort of any foreign aid or development loans to sort of help these countries move forward and push them toward recognizing China and sort of, moving away from Taiwan. China might also issue loans or foreign aid for political goodwill, and we want to know here sort of, overall, what is the influence on voting patterns in the UN and other multilateral institutions? So, for example, has China used these economic engagements to, align its interests more closely in the political arena with other countries? So we note that, I think in the case of Brazil, China actually gave Brazil a tariff concession in exchange for a vote to the WTO. China wanted a seat in the WTO in the early 2000s, so gave some economic concessions there. But this is an interesting study looking forward because we know that, China's big strategy right now is definitely economic-based, but who knows in the future whether this could change, and the political arena is definitely an interesting place for future study to occur. We're going to be looking into this a little bit more in the spring quarter, but we are open now to questions, and again, we want to thank Public Policy Department, Joe, Russell, and of course our client, so thank you so much.
Aside from the effects on UN voting behavior, what have you considered at all the impacts on domestic policy? And I'm thinking of particularly in the past, the Soviet Union would fund a lot or have kind of similar investment in everything in Cuba, and that kind of allowed them to sustain this experiment. And I was just wondering if that might contribute in some way to less, I guess, internationally popular policies in places like Venezuela and Argentina. And then the other thing I was wondering was what happens when substitutes are developed for some of these natural resources? Because that happened with Bolivia and tin, and I think it's happening with copper now. So
Okay, I don't have an answer for the second one, definitely. Yes, that one, because it's difficult to forecast the future. Having said that, the price of the commodities, which I get in my mind is the best reflect of the, the interaction of the demand and the supply, but also about this idea of there's another product that might work as copper. The price is in the high end of the story of copper, so I guess it's going to be there for a while, especially because China cannot afford to not grow as it has done in the last 20 years. Because remember that there's about 800 million poor people in the countryside, and a revolution of those people might create a disaster in the country. And especially considering that there's no democracy, so there's a dictatorship, political leadership. So the politicians in China are really concerned about, the growth of the country, and that's why I guess they need to keep growing in the next 50 years at the same rate.
So
yeah.
To answer your first question regarding sort of where China's going in the political sphere, that's not necessarily multilateral organizations. We note that, for example, countries like Haiti and the Dominican Republic still recognize Taiwan. And, in a lot of these countries, they've typically looked to the United States as basically regarded Latin America as its backyard for a really long time, right? So a lot of these countries rely on the United States for funding and for foreign aid. With the recent financial crisis, we know that the United States is able to give less. So if this is a trend moving forward, we see China sort of, moving into the sphere and, not necessarily replacing, but looking as, a very attractive substitute to United States foreign aid. And we might see definitely the giving of foreign aid translating into sort of like these domestic policies that will look favorable to China.
I mean, two clear examples of China using its power, economic power in Latin America were, say for example in the Taiwan issue, the only two countries which have let go of recognizing Taiwan in between 2000 and 2010 are Dominica and Costa Rica, which are both Latin American countries. So when there was a situation where China was, in Dominica it was a small country and they were able to give $100 million of aid over 5 years, and if you read the press reports about the president's statement, it clearly says that, I mean, we'd like to recognize Taiwan, but for our people, we'll have to make this sacrifice. And even in Costa Rica. So Costa Rica is sort of a counterexample to the example for Chile and Peru. So Chile and Peru have this natural resource that China wants, and you saw that asymmetry in the duty tariffs that was there. They have a free trade agreement again with Costa Rica, but the tariffs are at the same level. So if 90% of tariffs are duty-free from China to Costa Rica, it's the same the other way around, because one, there's no natural resource, and the other thing was it was sort of a political reward for them to re-recognize Taiwan again. So it was, you can see, it's because the data points are so low that you can't make that China's a rogue statement, but there are definite stories that you can follow and see. So for example, we've seen that Chinese investment at times has, we were discussing this as part of some of the research questions we might like to do as trying to influence state elections in these countries. So when you talk about domestic policy, is when China brings in investment in mining, in copper, in a certain province, is that going to change the way the elections go? But again, a lot of that evidence is very anecdotal. So there's no grand regression that you can run and try to make a judgment on that.
Okay, Dr. Chen.
Well, I just want to first of all, for great presentation. I know you guys have done a lot of good work. Looking back from when you started, it was a huge topic and a lot of different possible directions you can go into, and now you have a very cohesive story to tell from looking at the trade data, finding patterns in there, and narrow that down to look at the commodities and looking at the several countries, and then looking at the instruments that China uses to engage with these countries. One comment, in terms of, I don't know, what your plan is for after this class, what you plan to do. This definitely, your analysis has shown that China has used a variety of instruments, and it seems to be having pretty successful in terms of growing the relationship with Latin America. But some of these instruments, for example, you mentioned that the conditions on lending, that's very different from Western countries or development banks like the World Bank, or lending to countries that are not considered to be credit worthy, at least by the Western standards. What kind of risks are there in using these type of maybe not the Washington consensus type of policies? Are they, because within China, a lot of their state-owned enterprises run into big trouble with the banks. Banks are, they are not very transparent in terms of the conditions they impose on lending. There's huge amount of debt. So could this potentially, be a risk in the future rather than now it's convenient, it's doing well, but what are the risks?
Do you mean a risk for China?
Or yeah, both for China and
For Latin
the
America.
Latin American countries.
So I'd probably answer that. So for both countries. So let me take all the three stakeholders that we have. If so you are the U.S. government accountability office. So let's take the U.S., China, and Latin America. So a comparison, there have been a whole bunch of studies which have looked at how World Bank loans, small regional development bank loans like the IADB or Caribbean Development Bank, and how these Chinese loans work. And the overarching theme is that, one, they're not tied to any policy outcome. So if there was a World Bank loan that went into developing a hydropower plant in, say, Argentina or somewhere, there'd be a lot of conditions imposed on what environmental standards need to be maintained, what sort of building standards need to be maintained. In our research, we found that none of those were present in any of the agreements that were with China. So definitely there's the environmental, the infrastructural argument where it could be that China is just rushing really fast with this, which may not really secure the resources that they have there itself. So that's one answer. The other is that, we weren't able to make this as a grand conclusion because there are just so many caveats, but is China like the new United States of the 70s? So you see that resource extraction is something that is really important. China is trying to make itself the new US in that area, and they're pumping in cash. So if you look at the trade balance that US has with each of these countries, it's positive for the US right now, while China is giving a lot of cash away for these natural resources. So for this short-term gain, what has happened is Latin America, especially these commodity-rich countries, have accumulated cash, which has allowed them to impose fiscal reforms in a lot of these countries, which means that they've been able to conduct more far-reaching financial policy decisions just because of the fact that they have reserves which they can bank on. But however, what that means is that, again, there might be a time when they become so dependent on China coming in, and if a problem like substitutes coming in comes in place, and Chile finds that they can't export as much copper, that just leads to a point where they'll be out of a consumer for that supply. So there's both a financial risk and a long-term like political risk in place. And I mean, I'm sort of giving a very vague answer, but the answer has to be vague because it's so different for each of these countries that it's really difficult to give one cohesive argument.
And also to give a specific example, like in terms of risk to China, there's a reason why Western companies, Western banks are loath to lend to a country like Venezuela, right? It could be the case that China hasn't been in the international game quite as long and underestimates these political risks. For example, since Chavez passed away, people are foreseeing a lot of political upheaval in Venezuela, and maybe all these investments that China made are going to be under threat, or because there's all this political upheaval, they're not going to be able to keep the oil pumps flowing as well as they could. So in that sense, China might be undertaking a lot more risks than they are anticipating. So it could pose a risk to China as well.
Plus each of these countries are so different. So for example, we were discussing yesterday on how in Argentina, for now at least, oil is on a hiatus. There have been investments in the past where they've gone for exploration and tried to purchase equity in the national firm, but because but in soybeans, because the farmers in Argentina are so strong and the local unions are so big that they demand that they need an exporter to make money, which is why China engages in soybeans much more than it does in oil. So each commodity itself in every country has a different story, a different dynamic, which sort of changes how China engages with them.
Drew was next, I think.
Yeah, it was just a quick question, because I know China's strategy towards Latin America isn't unique to Latin America, and doing a lot of the similar stuff in Africa, but I have heard there's growing resentment, especially in Africa, to the way that China goes about its business. It's strictly extractive and not really an investment in the country for the country. It's only investment for extraction and in the sense of using these countries. Have you seen similar stuff in Latin America? Is that a concern?
Yeah, especially Peru, where China has their main FDI investment in the mining sector. We have seen several strikes and problems. And quite related with what Rajan said before, the standards of the Chinese companies are below instead of the Western companies. So in the mining sector, for instance, they have done huge damage to the environmental side. Venezuela, we don't know. Probably yes, but we don't know much. And all the other investment are in a partnership with a local company or international company. So we have not seen that pattern in our place. What does happen in Africa, though, is that they have done a lot of FTA as through, and that has created some noise.
Also, it's important to note that Latin America has become more important over the last decade. Like, it's just, if you look at the amount of investment, amount of loans, amount of everything that has gone, it's just shot up from basically zero in 2000 to right now. So where it's just booming. So a lot of those stories, like the parts of whether people are dissatisfied, if the jobs that it's creating more of an economic inequality. Those questions may probably be answered only 10, 20 years down the road.
Yeah.
Where you see those.
Yeah, Latin America is maybe 5 to 10 years behind Africa in terms of its involvement with China. I would say this is a ballpark figure. And although China's been focused on natural resource extraction, that's not the exclusive thing it's been doing. For example, I think there's been, like, Huawei, a state-owned telecoms company, has been building a lot of IT infrastructure in Latin American countries. So while they're focusing on natural resources, they're doing a lot of other things as well. So, on the whole, it's hard to say whether all of it is during a presentment or if it's just the natural resources.
So, and even in the numbers that we present, so China has a very blurry line in what they call foreign aid. So their definition of foreign aid is very different than what you would see on USAID.com. So it has loans, it has investment. So if you break down the numbers on each of those, on what China officially states as its policy, so they have a foreign aid white paper that they just released in 2011. So in that, you can clearly see that the breakup of those loans and that investment that they make in Africa is very different than what they do in Latin America. So in Africa, there's a lot more infrastructure development. So the kinds of general infrastructure loans that Kenneth talked about, where they develop an infrastructure around a given sector, because a lot of it is underdeveloped. However, in Latin America, so if you consider a chunk of 100% in each, I'd say that around 70% of these loans, investments, and foreign aid that China says is aid goes into infrastructure development in Africa. But on the other hand, in the official policy paper itself, around 75% in Latin America goes towards natural resource extraction. So even in their policy paper, they say that their probably main goal is resource extraction. So if it's creating a hospital in Africa, it's creating a road where they can transport the iron ore across the country. So there's that subtle difference.
Yeah, probably the political regimes also matter.
Question here. Have you guys identified any of these 3 or 4 economic interactions as the most politically compromising? And besides UN voting behavior, do you see any risk for Latin America for ideological influence from China in any of the countries?
What do you mean by politically compromised?
Like making a long-term tie to some political position imposed by China in the long term, related to any of those kinds of economic interactions?
I would say yes, but you have a chicken-egg problem. So, for instance, in Venezuela, where the point is very clear, there's a ton of reports and research about how China is feeding the coffers of formerly President Chavez, and how Chavez is spending all that money, for their own interest. But on the other hand, Venezuela didn't have access to the international markets. So, it's either China or nothing. And obviously there's a compromise or long-term compromise, but perhaps it's better than nothing. So there's an influence, but in my opinion, there was not another option considering the regime that Venezuela had at that point in time.
And ideologically speaking, so I mean, most of it out there is anecdotal, but so you can have anecdotal evidence of like ideologies either turning rapidly, or it could be even that China is becoming more liberal or open in its thought. So especially when you look at UN voting behavior, we looked at a lot of literature out there. And so there's clear evidence that US foreign aid and US control over the General Assembly has been going down. So US foreign aid is not exacting the foreign policy outcomes that it desires because it doesn't explicitly state that. So our looking forward question was that if they're not winning and if the agreement is not with them, who is it with? So that's one. And there have been recent studies. So we were in contact with a professor at Georgetown University who's releasing a paper in April where they look at China's foreign policy, China's effects on foreign policy, especially related to human rights resolutions passed in the General Assembly. And in the, again, limited data set that they have between 1992 to 2006, they found that countries have increasingly started voting with China on human rights issues. So in that paper that he states, previously only 30% of countries used to vote with them, and now it's somewhere around 62%. So of the countries that used to disagree with them are now increasingly saying yes with them. But again, the sheer amount of data that's out there, the thousands of resolutions that are passed, it's very difficult to say whether China is increasingly becoming better at its human rights or whether Latin America is completely switching over to the other side. So again, that needs more granular analysis, which probably will be done in spring.
I wanted to add a quick point regarding your first question. I think as Juan mentioned, there are 5 clear winners in Latin America in terms of China's natural resource extraction strategy. I'm not going to say that the rest of the 17 Latin American countries are losers per se, but there is a big concern that as China is acquiring these natural resources, it's turning them around and sending them back to Latin America as manufactured products. And definitely Costa Rica, for example, has a huge manufacturing sector. So there's a big concern moving forward about how are Chinese manufactured products displacing Latin American products within their own borders? How do you deal with this economically moving forward? That's a question.
Okay, any other questions? We'll do one quick one. Anybody? Okay, great. Thank you.
And a hand for Joe and Russ for leading this whole effort and producing such remarkably improved results compared to the distant past.
So again, thanks to everyone for coming. For the teams, thank you very much. Great jobs across the board. You can have the night off. You know the schedule for the rest of your deliverables, so give it to me when they're due. And we'll see you guys again soon. Thank you.